Write down your name, right now if you can. Don't think about it too much, just write it the way you normally would, fast, like you've done 10,000 times before. Now look at it. How big are the letters? How much pressure did you press into the page? Does your writing lean forward, or stay upright, or pull slightly backward? Are your letters connected, or do they stand separately from each other? You probably haven't thought about any of these things before. Most people don't. Handwriting is one of those things we do on autopilot, something we learned as children and then stopped thinking about entirely. But here's what's strange. Even though you stopped thinking about it, your handwriting didn't stop changing. It kept developing, quietly, all the way into adulthood, shaped by things you were never consciously aware of. Your mood on a given day, your habitual tension levels, your cognitive style, even your neurological health. And by the end of this video, you'll be able to look at your own handwriting, or anyone else's, and actually understand what's happening inside the system producing it. But before we get there, if this is the kind of thing that genuinely interests you, hit like and subscribe right now. It takes 2 seconds, it helps the channel more than most people realize, and there's a lot more of this coming. Alright, graphology, the study of handwriting and what it reveals, has a complicated history. For a long time, it was treated as a science on par with astrology, something people believed in but that couldn't hold up under scrutiny. And to be fair, many of the old graphology claims were exactly that. Pseudoscience dressed up in formal language. But in the last decade or so, something interesting happened. Researchers started separating the legitimate measurable signals in handwriting from the mythology around it. And what they found is that handwriting really does carry information, just not always the information the old graphologists claimed. Let's start with size, because it's one of the most studied variables. Large handwriting, letters that take up significant space on the page, has been consistently linked in research with a preference for social interaction and external attention, not extroversion in the pop psychology sense of loud person, but in the cognitive sense, a tendency to orient outward toward people and environment, rather than inward. Small handwriting tends to run in the opposite direction. Research has found consistent associations with focused attention and a tendency toward detail-oriented thinking. People who write small often work well in environments that require sustained concentration, not because small writing causes that, but because the same underlying attentional style that shapes how someone works also shapes how they physically use space on a page. Here's the part that makes this more interesting than a personality quiz, though. Letter size fluctuates. The same person writing under stress tends to write smaller. Under excitement or social stimulation, writing tends to grow. Your default size is a baseline, but it shifts, and those shifts carry their own signal. There's a related finding that most people find counterintuitive. Studies looking at handwriting in people with high creative output found that creative professionals often show more size variation within a single piece of writing than non-creative controls. Not chaotic variation, but natural swells and contractions, as if the writing is breathing with a thought being expressed. Consistency of size, paradoxically, sometimes correlates with more rigid, rule-bound thinking. Variation signals a brain that's modulating as it goes. Pressure is perhaps the most physiologically direct signal in handwriting. Heavy pressure, ink that presses deep into the page, correlates with high arousal states. Tension, strong emotion, high energy. Forensic document examiners use pressure analysis as one of the baseline tools when assessing authenticity, precisely because it's hard to consciously fake over a long document. Your nervous system is doing the pressing, not your intention. Light pressure tends to correlate with lower physical energy, or a more cautious engagement with the task at hand. In medical contexts, a sudden shift toward dramatically lighter pressure in someone whose handwriting was previously firm is sometimes a flag worth noting. It can precede or accompany neurological changes, fatigue states, or significant health shifts. This is where graphology intersects most clearly with medicine. Neurologists have long used handwriting as a diagnostic window. Parkinson's disease produces a highly specific pattern, micrographia, where letters progressively shrink as a person writes, sometimes within a single sentence. The tremor and motor control disruption of various neurological conditions show up clearly in handwriting before they're visible in other ways. Not because the brain is expressing something, but because fine motor coordination is a surprisingly sensitive instrument, and handwriting uses it in a very controlled, repeatable way. In one particularly striking line of research, scientists trained machine learning models on handwriting samples and found they could detect early markers of Parkinson's with meaningful accuracy, not from the content of the writing, but purely from the physical dynamics of it: pen pressure over time, the smoothness of transitions between letters, the consistency of letter height. The handwriting wasn't telling the researchers about someone's personality, it was telling them about the state of a nervous system, in the same way a blood pressure reading tells you about the state of a cardiovascular system. Same idea, different instrument. The slant of handwriting is more psychologically complex, and also more culturally variable, which is why it's worth being careful about. A rightward slant, letters leaning in the direction of writing, has historically been associated with responsiveness to social and emotional cues, a tendency to move toward people and situations rather than away from them. A leftward slant is rarer and more interesting. It sometimes appears in people who have learned to write with one dominant hand but show natural tendencies toward the other, a marker of the complex neural crossover involved in handedness. It also appears under conditions of emotional withdrawal or guardedness, though the research on slant is messier than on size or pressure, and cultural scripting of how children learn to write plays a significant role. No slant at all, perfectly vertical writing, is associated in several studies with a strong preference for rationality and deliberate control. Not coldness exactly, but a tendency to evaluate before responding rather than responding immediately. One caveat worth naming clearly: slant research is the weakest of the major handwriting variables, precisely because it's so easy to teach and consciously override. When you learn to write as a child, your teacher almost certainly had an opinion on slant. Different countries and different eras of handwriting instruction produced different default slants. So when you see slant in someone's writing, you're seeing a mix of what they were taught and what they've naturally drifted toward. And teasing those two things apart is genuinely difficult. The research is real, but slant is the variable where cultural scripting does the most work. Letter connection is where things get genuinely fascinating from an evolutionary and cognitive standpoint. When you connect letters fluently, one flowing into the next without lifting the pen, your brain is running a different kind of process than when you print each letter separately. Printed letters, each one discrete, constructed individually, engage more deliberate, stepwise processing. Research has found that people who prefer printing tend to score higher on measures of independent thinking and tend to be more skeptical of received wisdom. The hypothesis isn't complicated. If you're someone who pauses between letters, you may be someone who pauses between assumptions. What makes this relevant beyond personality is what happens when these patterns break down. A person who normally writes with fluent, connected letters and suddenly begins printing or loses the smooth connection between letters may be experiencing something cognitive worth paying attention to: fatigue, distraction, or more concerning changes in processing speed. There's also a broader research context here that's worth knowing about. Several studies have found that children who learn to write by hand, particularly in cursive, show stronger reading comprehension and memory consolidation than those who only type. The theory is that the physical act of writing letters by hand is itself a memory encoding process. The brain is doing more work to produce each character, and that additional effort leaves a stronger trace. This isn't an argument against keyboards. It's just a reminder that the physical act of writing is doing something the screen can't quite replicate, and that something has measurable cognitive consequences. So, what does your handwriting actually reveal? The honest answer is less than the old graphologists claimed, and more than most people assume. It doesn't reliably tell you someone's deep personality type or predict their behavior. Those claims were mostly mythology. What it does carry, measurably and consistently, is information about your current neurological and arousal state, your habitual attentional style, and your fine motor coordination over time. The most important word there is change. A single sample of your handwriting is relatively limited. A series of samples over time is a genuinely useful window on stress, health, and cognitive function. Precisely because your handwriting is a consistent enough behavior that deviations stand out. You've been signing your name the same rough way for decades. If that signature suddenly looks different, something in the system producing it has changed. Not who you are, but how the system running you is doing right now. And that, more than any personality claim, is what handwriting actually reveals. Write something down tomorrow morning, then again next week. You're not taking a personality test. You're running a diagnostic on a system that's been quietly recording its own condition every time you pick up a pen.